The German officer felt the first symptoms during lunch. A slight nausea. Nothing alarming initially. Field rations and military cooking were never gentle on the stomach. But within an hour, the nausea had intensified. His head pounded. His stomach cramped violently. Around him, other officers and soldiers in the mess hall were experiencing similar symptoms. Some had already vomited. Others were doubled over in pain. It was August 1943 in the village of Obol, Belarus, occupied by German forces since 1941. The German garrison stationed there had been operating without major incident for months. Local resistance activity had been manageable, but today something was catastrophically wrong. By evening, the garrison's medical staff was overwhelmed. Dozens of German soldiers were seriously ill. Several were dying. The garrison commander ordered an immediate investigation. Food poisoning was suspected, but the scale suggested something more sinister. Someone had deliberately contaminated the garrison's food. The kitchen staff was interrogated. Among them was a 17-year-old girl named Zinaida Portnova, who had been working as a kitchen aide for only a few weeks. When German officers confronted her, Zinaida denied everything. "The food isn't poisoned," she insisted. "I eat the same food you do." To prove her innocence, she ate a portion of the soup right in front of the interrogating officers. She showed no immediate reaction. The Germans, unable to definitively prove her guilt and convinced by her bold demonstration, released her. What the Germans didn't know was that Zinaida had indeed poisoned their food, and the poison she had just consumed would nearly kill her within hours. This was calculated risk-taking at a level that shocked even her fellow resistance fighters. Within days, over 100 German soldiers would be dead or seriously incapacitated. And Zinaida Portnova, a teenager who should have been finishing school, would be hunted across Belarus until her capture and execution 5 months later. This is the story of how a 15-year-old girl became one of the Soviet Union's most effective partisans, how her hatred of the occupation drove her to increasingly dangerous operations, and how she chose death over betraying her comrades. Zinaida Martinovna Portnova was born on February 20th, 1926, in Leningrad. She was the eldest daughter of a working-class Belarusian family. Her father worked at the Kirov plant, one of Leningrad's major industrial facilities. Her younger sister Galia was 8 years her junior. Zinaida, known as Zina to family and friends, was a typical Soviet schoolgirl, attending the 385th school in Leningrad, studying 7th grade in 1941. That summer, Zina and her sister Galia were sent to stay with their grandmother in the village of Zue, near Obol, in the Vitebsk region of Belarus. This was common practice for Soviet families, sending children to the countryside for summer with relatives. It was supposed to be a peaceful break from city life. Instead, it became the experience that defined the rest of Zina's short life. On June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The scale and speed of the German advance shocked the world. Within 1 week, German forces had penetrated 200 miles into Soviet territory. Within months, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers were dead, injured, or missing. The Red Army was being systematically destroyed by German tactical superiority and overwhelming force. Belarus, where Zina and Galia were staying with their grandmother, was directly in the path of the German advance. By late June, German forces had occupied large portions of Belarus, including the Vitebsk region. The village of Obol, where Zina's grandmother lived, fell under German military occupation. The occupation changed everything. German military authorities took control of local administration. Soviet citizens were subjected to harsh occupation policies. Jews were rounded up for deportation and execution. Anyone suspected of communist sympathies or resistance activity faced arrest, torture, and death. The brutality of the occupation was immediate and undeniable. For 15-year-old Zina, the occupation became personal when German soldiers attempted to confiscate her grandmother's cattle. Livestock was valuable to occupation forces, both for feeding troops and for transport. German soldiers routinely confiscated animals from occupied populations without compensation. According to Henry Sakaida's book Heroines of the Soviet Union, 1941-45, when Zina's grandmother protested the confiscation, German soldiers struck her. They hit an old woman for objecting to theft of her property. Zina witnessed this. The image of German soldiers beating her grandmother crystallized something in the teenage girl. This was not an abstract political conflict. This was personal. These invaders had struck her family. From that moment, Zina hated the Germans with an intensity that would drive her actions for the rest of her life. In 1942, a year after the German occupation began, Zina joined the resistance. The Belarusian resistance movement was extensive and well organized despite German efforts to suppress it. Various groups operated throughout occupied Belarus, conducting sabotage operations, gathering intelligence, and helping Soviet partisans operating from forest bases. Zina joined a resistance cell called the Young Avengers, the youth division of the underground Komsomol organization operating in Obol. The Komsomol, formerly known as the All-Union Leninist Young Communist League, was the youth wing of the Communist Party. During the occupation, underground Komsomol cells became resistance organizations. The Young Avengers, despite their dramatic name, were deadly serious about their work. They were teenagers, most between 14 and 18 years old, but they conducted operations that required courage and discipline far beyond their years. Zina, at 16, quickly proved herself valuable to the organization. Her first assignments were relatively low risk but important. She distributed Soviet propaganda leaflets throughout German-occupied Belarus. These leaflets reminded the population that Soviet forces would eventually return and encouraged resistance to the occupation. Distribution was dangerous. Anyone caught with anti-German materials faced immediate execution, but Zina's youth made her less suspicious to German patrols. She also collected and hid weapons for Soviet soldiers and partisans. German occupation forces confiscated weapons from the civilian population, but resistance members systematically gathered whatever firearms they could find and cached them for future use. Zina helped maintain these weapon caches, moving guns and ammunition to secure hiding places. Additionally, she spied on German troop movements, noting which units were stationed where when patrols moved through specific areas and what defensive positions the Germans maintained. This intelligence was passed to Soviet partisan units operating in the forests around Obol. The information helped partisans plan ambushes and sabotage operations. But Zina wanted to do more than gather intelligence and distribute leaflets. She wanted to directly strike back at the Germans who had beaten her grandmother and occupied her country. The older members of the Young Avengers recognized her determination and began training her in weapons and explosives. By late 1942, Zina was participating in sabotage operations. She took part in attacks on a local power plant, a water pump facility, and a brick factory, all infrastructure supporting the German occupation. These weren't symbolic gestures. The attacks caused real damage and, more importantly, killed German soldiers. Historical estimates suggest these sabotage operations killed upwards of 100 German soldiers between late 1942 and early 1943. Zina wasn't conducting these operations alone. She worked with other Young Avengers members, but she was directly involved in planning and executing attacks that inflicted significant casualties on occupation forces. German authorities were increasingly concerned about resistance activity in the Obol area. They increased patrols, conducted raids on suspected resistance sympathizers, and executed anyone caught engaging in anti-German activities. But they consistently underestimated the threat posed by teenagers. German military intelligence simply didn't seriously consider that youth resistance groups could be conducting lethal operations. This cognitive blind spot would cost them dearly. By summer 1943, Zina had been fighting the occupation for over a year. She had participated in multiple sabotage operations. She had helped Soviet partisans. She had risked her life repeatedly. But her most audacious operation was still ahead. In August 1943, Zina secured employment as a kitchen aide at the German garrison in Obol. How she obtained this position isn't entirely clear from surviving records. She may have used false papers, or she may have simply applied and been accepted because the Germans needed kitchen help and didn't suspect a 17-year-old girl of being a trained saboteur. Working in the German garrison kitchen gave Zina access to an opportunity that resistance fighters rarely obtained: the ability to poison the food of an entire garrison simultaneously. She planned carefully. She needed a poison that would work quickly enough to sicken the Germans before they could trace the source, but not so quickly that her involvement would be obvious. She also needed enough poison to contaminate food for potentially hundreds of German soldiers. The exact poison Zina used isn't definitively documented in surviving records. Some accounts suggest it was arsenic, which was available in Belarus and had been used in other resistance operations. Others suggest it may have been rat poison or other toxic substances. What is clear is that whatever poison she used, she had enough of it to contaminate a large batch of food. On a day in August 1943, the exact date isn't recorded in available documents, Zina added poison to soup being prepared for the garrison mess hall. She worked in the kitchen, so her presence near the food wasn't suspicious. She had access, she had opportunity, and she took it. The soup was served at lunch. Hundreds of German soldiers ate it. Within hours, the garrison was in chaos. Soldiers were vomiting violently. Others had severe diarrhea and stomach cramps. The garrison medical staff was overwhelmed by the sudden influx of patients. By evening, some soldiers were dying. The garrison commander immediately suspected food poisoning, but the scale and severity suggested deliberate contamination. He ordered the kitchen staff arrested and interrogated. Zina was among those detained. From the German garrison's perspective, the situation was a catastrophic security failure. Someone had penetrated their kitchen and poisoned their food. Dozens of soldiers were seriously ill. Several were dying, and they had no idea who was responsible. The garrison's security officers interrogated kitchen staff aggressively. They needed to identify the saboteur quickly, both to prevent further attacks and to demonstrate that German security couldn't be breached with impunity. Each kitchen worker was questioned about their background, their activities, their contacts with the local population. When they interrogated Zina, she denied everything with remarkable composure for a 17-year-old. She insisted she had nothing to do with any poisoning. She claimed she ate the same food as the German soldiers. There was no reason she would poison food she was eating herself. The German officers were skeptical but had no concrete evidence. Zina's youth worked in her favor. The interrogators found it difficult to believe this teenage girl was a trained saboteur capable of killing dozens of German soldiers. She seemed too young, too innocent. Then Zina made a move that shocked everyone in the interrogation room. She said if the officers believed the food was poisoned, she would eat some right in front of them to prove it was safe. It was a brilliant psychological gambit. A guilty person wouldn't willingly consume poisoned food. The gesture demonstrated confidence in her innocence. The German officers brought a bowl of the soup that had sickened their soldiers. Zina took the bowl and ate a portion of it. She showed no immediate reaction. She didn't vomit. She didn't appear ill. She simply ate the soup calmly and set the bowl down. The German officers couldn't explain this. If the soup was poisoned, and clearly it was, given the number of soldiers who had fallen ill, how could this girl eat it without becoming sick? The most logical conclusion was that she hadn't been the one who poisoned it. Perhaps the contamination had come from spoiled ingredients or accidental introduction of toxins during preparation. Lacking definitive evidence and confused by Zina's willingness to eat the soup, the German officers released her. They continued investigating other kitchen staff members, but Zina was no longer their primary suspect. What the Germans didn't understand was that Zina had just gambled with her life in a calculated risk that demonstrated extraordinary courage and cold-bloodedness. She had indeed poisoned the soup, and she had just consumed poison that would nearly kill her. Zina left the German garrison as quickly as possible, without appearing suspicious. She made it back to her grandmother's house. Then the poison hit. The symptoms began within a few hours. Violent nausea. Vomiting so severe, it left her weak and dehydrated. Stomach cramps that doubled her over in agony. She had consumed less poison than the German soldiers, just a small portion of the soup, but it was still enough to make her desperately ill. Zina's grandmother and fellow resistance members cared for her through the crisis. According to surviving accounts, they made her drink large quantities of whey, a traditional treatment for poisoning that helps dilute toxins and promote vomiting to expel them from the system. Zina spent days vomiting, barely able to hold down liquids, suffering from the effects of the poison she had consumed to maintain her cover. But she survived. After approximately a week, she had recovered enough to move, and by that time, the full impact of her operation was clear. Over 100 German soldiers from the Obol garrison were dead or seriously incapacitated. Some had died within days. Others remained critically ill for weeks. The garrison's combat effectiveness had been severely degraded. It would take months to fully replace the losses. When Zina didn't return to work at the garrison kitchen, the German officers realized they had been deceived. The girl who had eaten the soup to prove it wasn't poisoned, she had been the saboteur all along. She had willingly consumed poison to throw them off her trail. The audacity of it was almost incomprehensible. German military police launched an intensive search for Zina Portnova. Her name and description were circulated to all German units in the Vitebsk region. Patrols searched villages and farms. Informants were offered rewards for information leading to her capture. The Germans wanted her badly, not just for punishment, but as an example to other resistance members that sabotage would be met with brutal retaliation. Zina couldn't remain in Obol. The Germans knew her face. They knew her name. They knew her family. Staying would mean certain capture. She left her grandmother's house and fled to the forests, where Soviet partisan units operated beyond German control. She joined a partisan detachment named after Kliment Voroshilov, a Soviet military leader. In a letter smuggled to her parents in besieged Leningrad that month, Zina wrote, "Mom, we are now in a partisan detachment. Together with you, we will defeat the Nazi invaders." In the forests, Zina became a scout for the partisan unit. She had proven her courage and capability. She could blend into civilian populations when necessary. She could gather intelligence on German positions, and she had demonstrated a willingness to risk her life that impressed even hardened partisan commanders. Life as a Soviet partisan was brutal. Partisan units lived in forest camps, moving constantly to avoid German encirclement operations. They faced shortages of food, medicine, and ammunition. Winter conditions were especially harsh. Temperatures in Belarus could drop to minus 20 or 30 degrees Celsius, and partisans often lacked proper winter clothing or shelter. But partisan units were effective. They disrupted German supply lines by destroying railways and bridges. They ambushed German patrols and convoys. They gathered intelligence that was radioed to Soviet military command. They provided psychological support to occupied populations by demonstrating that resistance was possible and that the Germans could be hurt. Zina conducted reconnaissance missions, slipping into German-controlled areas to observe troop movements and defensive positions. She was particularly valuable because her youth and appearance made her less suspicious to German patrols. She could pose as a civilian going about normal business while actually gathering intelligence for partisan operations. In October 1943, Zina officially joined the VLKSM, the full Komsomol organization, not just the youth division. This formal membership recognized her status as a committed resistance fighter who had proven herself under fire. For several months, Zina operated successfully as a partisan scout. She participated in operations that attacked German patrols and supply convoys. She helped gather intelligence for partisan ambushes. And she continued to demonstrate the courage that had defined her actions since joining the resistance. In December 1943, or early January 1944, sources differ on the exact date. Zina was given a dangerous assignment. The Young Avengers resistance cell in Obol had suffered several recent failures. Operations had been compromised. Members had been arrested. The partisan command needed to know what had gone wrong. Zina was ordered to return to Obol, infiltrate the German garrison if possible, discover why the Young Avengers operations were failing, and make contact with surviving resistance members. It was an extremely high-risk mission. The Germans had been hunting Zina for months. They knew her face. Obol was the last place she should return to. But orders were orders. Zina understood the importance of the mission. If the Young Avengers network had been compromised by an informer or captured member, the entire resistance structure in the Obol area could collapse. Someone had to investigate. And Zina, despite the danger, was qualified for the task. She returned to Obol in early January 1944. She was careful, using cover identities and avoiding areas where she might be recognized. But in a small village, anonymity was difficult. Someone saw her, whether it was a German patrol, a collaborator, or simply bad luck. Zina was recognized. Local police arrested her. In occupied Belarus, local police forces often collaborated with German authorities, helping to maintain occupation control in exchange for relative safety and privileges. The police who arrested Zina knew she was wanted by the Germans. They turned her over to the Gestapo. The Gestapo, German secret police, took Zina to the village of Goriani for interrogation. They had been searching for her since August. They wanted information about the partisan unit she had joined, about other Young Avengers members, about Soviet intelligence operations in the area. They wanted names, locations, organizational structures. What happened during Zina's interrogation varies depending on which historical account you read. The details were documented by survivors and witnesses who heard different versions of the story. But the core facts are consistent. During interrogation, Zina refused to provide information. The Gestapo interrogator threatened her with torture and execution. She remained silent. At some point during the session, the interrogator's pistol was on the table between them. Whether he placed it there deliberately to intimidate her or simply set it down carelessly isn't clear. What is clear is that Zina seized the pistol. She shot the interrogator, killing him. When German soldiers heard the gunshot and rushed into the room, she shot them too. 2 more Germans fell. Zina ran from the interrogation room into the corridor. A guard tried to stop her. She shot him. She made it to the courtyard. Another guard confronted her. She shot him as well. She was making for the street for potential escape into the village and then to the forests, but her stolen pistol misfired when she tried to shoot a guard blocking the exit. The weapon jammed or ran out of ammunition. Before she could clear it or flee, German soldiers overwhelmed her. She was recaptured. The escape attempt was extraordinary. A 17-year-old girl, captured and unarmed, had killed her interrogator and 3 guards, shooting her way through a German compound in a desperate bid for freedom. She had nearly succeeded, but nearly wasn't enough. After recapture, Zina was subjected to torture. The Germans wanted information, but they also wanted revenge. She had killed 4 of their people. She had poisoned over 100 soldiers. She represented a humiliating security failure for German occupation forces. The torture continued for weeks. Various accounts suggest Zina was beaten, subjected to psychological torment, possibly burned or otherwise physically abused. The Gestapo had extensive experience in extracting information through pain and terror. But Zina provided no information. She revealed nothing about the partisan unit she had joined, nothing about other Young Avengers members, nothing about resistance networks in the area. Despite torture that would have broken many trained adults, this 17-year-old girl maintained operational security. Eventually, realizing they would get nothing from her, the Germans decided to execute her. On January 15, 1944, Gestapo personnel drove Zina into a forest near Goryany. She was shot and killed. She was 17 years old. She had been fighting the German occupation for 2 years. The Germans didn't announce her death publicly. They buried her in an unmarked location. For months, her family and fellow partisans didn't know for certain whether she was alive or dead. Only after Soviet forces liberated Belarus in 1944 did survivors provide testimony about Zina's capture, torture, and execution. After the war ended in May 1945, the Soviet government began documenting partisan actions and recognizing those who had fought against the occupation. Zina Portnova's story emerged through testimony from other Young Avengers members, from partisan commanders she had served under, and from witnesses to her operations. On July 1st, 1958, 14 years after her death, Zina Portnova was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the Soviet Union could bestow. She became the youngest female ever awarded this recognition. She also received the Order of Lenin. Monuments were erected in her honor in multiple locations throughout Belarus and Russia. In Minsk, the capital of Belarus, a bust commemorates her sacrifice. In the village of Obol, where she conducted her poisoning operation, an obelisk marks her memory. In Leningrad, later renamed St. Petersburg, a school was named after her. Numerous young pioneer groups throughout the Soviet Union adopted her name. Her story became part of Soviet World War II mythology. The teenage girl who poisoned an entire German garrison, ate the poison to prove her innocence, survived, and continued fighting until her capture and execution. It was a story that embodied courage, sacrifice, and commitment to defeating fascism. Western historians initially treated Soviet accounts of Zina's actions with skepticism, suspecting propaganda exaggeration. But after the Cold War ended and Soviet archives became more accessible, researchers confirmed the core facts of her story. She really had joined the resistance at age 16. She really had conducted sabotage operations. She really had poisoned German soldiers and eaten the poison herself to maintain her cover. And she really had been captured, tortured, and executed at age 17. The scale of casualties from the poisoning operation estimates range from 100 to several hundred German soldiers killed or incapacitated may have been inflated by Soviet propaganda. But even conservative estimates suggest Zina's operation killed or seriously sickened dozens of German soldiers in a single action. For a 17-year-old girl working alone in a garrison kitchen, this was an extraordinary military achievement. Zina Portnova's story raises difficult questions about child soldiers, about the nature of resistance warfare, and about what war does to young people thrust into adult violence. She was 15 when the Germans invaded and 16 when she joined the resistance. She was conducting lethal sabotage operations at an age when most teenagers are concerned with school, friends, and normal adolescent development. She killed people, many people, before turning 18, and she was tortured and executed before reaching adulthood. The Soviet Union celebrated her as a hero, which she was by any reasonable definition. She fought occupation forces. She conducted successful military operations. She accepted risks that killed many adult soldiers. She refused to betray her comrades under torture. These are heroic actions regardless of her age. But her story is also tragic. She should have been finishing school, thinking about career and future. Instead, she was poisoning German soldiers, fleeing through forests, conducting reconnaissance missions in enemy territory, and ultimately dying alone in a forest after weeks of torture. War destroyed her childhood and killed her before she reached adulthood. The occupation that prompted her resistance also robbed her of any possibility of normal life. There was no scenario where Zina Portnova lived to old age surrounded by grandchildren, looking back on her youth, the moment German soldiers struck her grandmother. The moment Zina joined the Young Avengers, her fate was essentially sealed. The Germans who died from her poisoning operation were also victims of war, though they represented the occupying force that had invaded her country. Many were probably not ideologically committed Nazis, but simply soldiers following orders, eating lunch in their garrison mess hall, and dying in agony hours later from poison administered by a teenage girl they never suspected. War creates these situations where 17-year-olds poison garrison kitchens and call it victory, where teenage girls are tortured to death for refusing to betray their friends, where normal moral frameworks collapse under the pressure of occupation, resistance, and survival. Zinaida Portnova fought the German occupation of Belarus for approximately 2 years, from age 16 to 17. During that time, she distributed Soviet propaganda leaflets under penalty of execution, collected and cached weapons for partisan use, gathered intelligence on German troop movements, participated in sabotage operations that killed upwards of 100 German soldiers, poisoned a German garrison, killing or incapacitating 100 or more soldiers. Aide poisoned herself to maintain her cover, nearly dying in the process, served as a scout for Soviet partisan units, conducted reconnaissance missions in German-controlled territory, shot and killed her Gestapo interrogator and 3 guards in an escape, endured weeks of torture without revealing information, died at age 17 without betraying her comrades. By any measure, this is an extraordinary record of resistance activity. Most adult soldiers never accomplish as much as Zina did before her 18th birthday. Her operations directly killed or incapacitated hundreds of German soldiers, disrupted occupation administration, and forced German forces to divert resources to hunting her. The poisoning operation alone, regardless of the exact casualty count, was one of the most successful individual sabotage actions conducted by any partisan in occupied Belarus. A single teenage girl, working alone in a garrison kitchen, eliminated an entire garrison's combat effectiveness for weeks or months. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. If a 17-year-old girl could penetrate their security and poison their food, how could they trust anything? And her final act, killing her interrogator and 3 guards before being recaptured, demonstrated that even facing certain death, Zina Portnova refused to go quietly. She fought until the end. The Soviet Union honored her posthumously with its highest award. Her name is commemorated on monuments, streets, and schools throughout Russia and Belarus. Her story has been told in books, articles, and documentaries. She became a symbol of youthful resistance, of courage under impossible circumstances, of sacrifice for homeland. But perhaps the most important legacy of Zina Portnova is simply this. She was a 15-year-old girl who saw injustice, who watched German soldiers beat her grandmother, and who decided that she would not accept occupation passively. She chose to fight, and she fought with a courage and effectiveness that few adults ever match. One teenage girl, 100 German soldiers dead. One daring escape attempt. Weeks of torture endured without breaking. Execution at 17. That is Zinaida Portnova's story. A story of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of resistance against occupation.